Hello and welcome to Vincent Wildlife Trust's first ever virtual bat walk, which we are delighted to offer as one of the events to celebrate Limerick's designation as a European Greenleaf City during 2020. We would like to express our thanks to those who have contributed the footage, images and echolocation calls in this video. However, the advantage of this virtual bat walk is that we can show you some fantastic footage of bats in flight that you would be very unlikely to see on an actual bat walk. Normally, our bat walks begin with us meeting a group of people before sunset on a warm, dry summer's evening.
Normally. But because of the COVID-19 pandemic, we and bat workers throughout Ireland are probably not going to be able to do our bat walks this summer. So, just like thousands of other people, we're turning to technology to allow us to share with you what happens on a bat walk from the comfort of your own home. I'd like you to imagine that we are standing in the car park of Curraghchase house and it is 20 minutes before sunset. Although the sun is shining and it is still warm, once the sun sets it will become cooler. So we always advise you to wear something warm. If the midges start to bite, we have eco-friendly insect repellent to pass around. We have chosen Curraghchase Forest Park for our walk because this location is without doubt the most important place in Limerick for bats. The park covers over 300 hectares of mixed woodlands, parkland and lakes, all ideal habitats for bats to live and feed. And as always, we are grateful to Coillte for giving us permission to run our bat walk here. Our most recent visit was in 2018 with the Limerick Bat Group. We will begin our walk over at the parkland, then move to the lake, walk to the rear of the ruin of Curraghchase house, and we will finish back at the lake.
We have promised that we will hear 6 bat species this evening, but we have 9 species in Ireland, all of which are protected by law. They range in size from the small pipistrelles that tip the scales at just 5 grams to our largest species, Leislers, weighing in at 16 grams. But, compared to bats found elsewhere in the world, and there are over 1,200 species, all our bats are small, and they all eat insects. They catch these insects using their hearing, because, although no bat is blind, sight is not so important for an animal that is active at night. The term echolocation is used to describe how bats use sounds to navigate and hunt insects in darkness. The bat emits the sound, which is ultrasonic and above our hearing range, either through its mouth or nostrils. The sound travels out, hits an object, and is returned to the bat as an echo, which allows the bat to decide if the object is stationary, such as a wall, that it needs to avoid, or an insect that is worth chasing. Bats analyse the echoes to determine the direction of travel of the object, and they can also differentiate soft surfaces from hard, which is important if the bat prefers to eat soft-bodied insects like moths rather than beetles. For humans to hear the ultrasonic calls produced by bats, we need to use special equipment called bat detectors, which transform the ultrasonic sounds of bats into audible sounds. Humans can hear sounds up to 20 kHz, but Irish bats navigate and hunt using sounds above 20 kHz, right up to 113 kHz.
This is the bat detector we will use on our walk. It's the Magenta Bat 5, but there are many different types of bat detector on the market, varying in price. But be warned, turning on a bat detector does not immediately allow us to identify the bats we are hearing. We first need to be aware of how good a listener we are. How well do we differentiate between different sounds? We are in fact able to quickly recognise the voice of someone we know when we are in a group of people, and we recognise that people have different accents. But bats produce calls of very short duration and usually at a rapid repetition rate. We say a bat call consists of pulses of sound, which makes it hard for us as humans to distinguish between the species. But with practice, we can recognise 6 species with a fair degree of confidence using a basic bat detector. The sun has just set, but there's still plenty of light, so no need to turn on any torches. In fact, Where possible, we like to walk with the bats using natural light for as long as it is safe to do so. Let's now move to the open parkland in front of the house. It's time to turn on the detectors and tune into the bats. To do this, we move the small wheel on the right hand side of the detector, which turns it on, then turn the large dial on the left of the detector to 25 kHz. Just as you tune your radio to 95 FM to hear Limerick Live or 100 to 102 FM to hear Today FM, we tune our bat detectors to certain frequencies to help us identify different species. Sound travels through air in waves, and we measure these in waves per second. One sound wave per second is called 1 Hz, but bat calls consist of thousands of sound waves per second, or kilohertz for short. At 25 kHz, we are at the best frequency to begin to listen for Leisler's bat, and we need to point the detector away from us and up to the sky, because this is where we're going to find this species, flying out in the open. Leisler's bat is the first bat to emerge in the evening, often before sunset, so it is possible to identify it by sight. Leisler's bat has long narrow wings with pointed wingtips that enable it to fly fast. I once watched a Leisler's bat hunting before sunset, and although I could see it clearly and had my detector switched on, I heard no calls because the bat was not using its echolocation, but rather its sight to locate insects. Leisler's bats produce two types of call, one that sounds like chop and one that sounds like chip. By referring to a chop sound and a chip sound, we are describing the tonal quality of the calls, and we're able to hear this because the calls are relatively long. The chop call consists of pulses that can be 20 milliseconds long, and the chip can be 10 milliseconds long. The chop sound we are hearing is being emitted by the bat at an almost constant frequency, so it's called the CF part of the call. We will hear this more clearly when we retune our detector down to 23 kHz. When we hear the chop sound but cannot see the bats, we know that they are flying out in the open and seeking information about objects some distance away. Now let's focus on the shorter call, chip. The chip part of the call is the frequency modulated or FM part of the call, and is best heard if we retune our detectors to 27 kHz. Bats use FM calls when they need detailed information quickly. This type of call is short in duration and is emitted by Leisler's bat when it is actively hunting insects or flying closer to vegetation, what we bat people like to call clutter. We know the bats are feeding, not only because we're hearing the quick chip calls, but because we can see the bats making short dives after the insects. In terms of rhythm, we say Leisler's bat calls have a slow rhythm, but this will obviously make more sense later when we're able to compare their call with that of the other species.
Leisler's bat is also one of the easier bat species to identify visually. It has rounded ears and a mushroom-shaped section in its ear called a tragus. The tragus is an additional feature in the ear of all Irish bats, with one exception. It varies in shape and length between species. We are lucky in Ireland that we can hear Leisler's bat on most of the bat walks we take, because it is one of our commoner species, unlike in other European countries, where it is rarer. This may be because Leisler's does not have competition from other, larger bat species. Another difference is that in Ireland, most of the roosts of this species are in buildings, whereas elsewhere it uses holes in trees. Although all bats have a basic wing structure, the shape of the wing varies between different species and, along with differences in size and weight, is important in determining where a bat will fly or its ecological niche. A bat wing is made up of two layers of skin, supported by the bones of the arm and the hand, with the wrist and fingers elongated to support it, like the ribs of an umbrella. The wing is attached to the side of the body, and in all Irish bats it continues down between the feet, where it is called the tail membrane. It is time now, as the daylight fades, to move away from Leisler's bats and the open parkland and to walk along some of the trails that lead to the lake.
Now we are standing along a mature hedgerow with trees, so tune your detector to 45 kHz so we can listen for the common pipistrelle, one of the 3 pipistrelle species we have in Ireland. Its call also has FM and CF parts, but unlike Leisler's, they are not separate calls but parts of the one call. The call starts with a short FM part and ends with a longer CF part, which we call the tail. We can hear these two parts on the detector by tuning up to hear the FM part, which sounds like a dry click, and then by turning down to hear the longer CF tail, which sounds like a wet smack. Once again, by referring to clicks and smacks, we are describing the tonal quality of the bat call. The dry click is short, composed of pulses of only 3 to 4 milliseconds long, so our human ears cannot hear any richness to the sound. But the smack is almost twice as long, 5 to 7 milliseconds, and is distinguishable as that smacking sound. Another clue to spotting the common pipistrelle is that it flies fast and erratically, and this flight pattern is mirrored in the rhythm of its call, which is irregular. It has been described as sounding like a marble hopping on a glass tabletop. I'll stop talking now so we can listen for this bat, which flies much lower than Leisler's, often just above our heads. Besides the smacks we've just heard at 45 kHz, there were other sounds distinguishable. These are what we call feeding buzzes and come at the end of a call as the bat closes in on the insect. Insect capture can be divided into 3 distinct phases: search, approach and terminal. Each phase is marked by a change in the rate of emission of pulses and the duration of each pulse of sound. In the search phase, the calls are loudest and the pulse repetition rate is about 10 per second. Quite slow really. This increases to 20 to 40 pulses per second and may reach to 100 per second in the moments before an insect is caught. And this phase is called the terminal phase. It's almost certainly the end of the road for the insect anyway, and we hear it as a buzzing sound on our detector.
It is time to leave the common pipistrelle and move to the edge of the lake, because we now want to hear the Soprano pipistrelle, which feeds almost exclusively close to water. We now tune our detectors to 55 kHz to hear the Soprano pipistrelle. Although we are now tuned to hear a different species, the calls we hear are still clicks and smacks, and this is because the Soprano and common pipistrelles are closely related and so sound similar. In fact, they were not recognised by us as 2 distinct species until 1997. Up to then, we thought that we had just one species that produced a call that ranged in frequency from 55 kHz down to 45 kHz, when in fact they were 2 separate species since proven by DNA analysis. In the common pipistrelle, the CF tail of the call, the smack, is best heard at 45 kHz, but in the Soprano pipistrelle this is best heard at 55 kHz. Be warned though, the distinction between what we call the 45 and 55 pips is not absolute, and most common pipistrelle calls lie between 44 and 48 kHz, and those of the Soprano pipistrelle between 52 and 56 kHz. The pipistrelle bats are the bats we encounter most often in our houses. Maternity colonies are formed by female bats that give birth to just one baby, which is called a pup, usually in June. A female will suckle her pup until August, when it becomes independent. Male bats generally live elsewhere during the summer, but the sexes do need to meet up and mate at some stage, and this happens from August onwards. Before we leave the pipistrelles, we said earlier that we have a third pipistrelle species. This is called Nethusiast pipistrelle, and it is a relatively new arrival to Ireland. It was recorded for the first time only in the mid-1990s, and although it has been detected in County Limerick, it has not been recorded yet at Curraghchase.
But one species that is found here is one of our rarest bats, the lesser horseshoe. The lesser horseshoe bat in Ireland is confined to 6 counties in the west, from Mayo in the north through Galway, Clare, Limerick, Kerry and West Cork, and is the only Irish bat with such a limited distribution, and one that we like to call the bat of the wild Atlantic way. There are many other facts that set the lesser horseshoe bat apart from our other species. It's the only one with an instantly recognisable face due to the horseshoe-shaped piece of cartilage that surrounds its nostrils. All other Irish bats, collectively known as the Vesper bats, have a simple face. The Vesper bats also have a tragus at the base of the ear, which is absent in the horseshoes. Vesper bats can land and crawl into small openings, using both their forelimbs and hind limbs, where the lesser horseshoe bat must fly directly into its roosts, like swallows, because it has limited quadrupedal movement. This means it isn't able to crawl, so it always hangs up to roost, supported only by its hind limbs. It prefers old unoccupied buildings in rural areas in summer and underground sites in winter. It travels short distances in summer, staying within 2 to 3 kilometres of its maternity summer roosts. Its echolocation call, as we shall soon hear, is unmistakable. To hear this bat, we now walk back towards the ruined Curraghchase house. Inside the gates you can see several outbuildings and an entrance to the basement of the ruin on the right hand side. On special occasions, we in the Limerick Bat Group have been given permission by Coillte and National Parks and Wildlife Service to pass through these gates so that we can stand outside these buildings and count the bats as they emerge, which is about 20 minutes after sunset.
The lesser horseshoe bat population declined dramatically during the last century throughout Europe, and for this reason it is classified under Annex 2 of the Habitats Directive, so special areas of conservation have been designated for it, and Curraghchase House is one of these. Indeed, Curraghchase is the most important site for the lesser horseshoe bat in County Limerick, because it provides it with everything it needs to survive and thrive. In summer, it forms a maternity colony in the outbuildings and feeds in the deciduous woodland and aquatic habitats nearby. In winter, it hibernates in the basement of the house. Although all Irish bat species hibernate, the lesser horseshoe is the only species we can monitor during winter, because we can see it hanging in the open in underground sites such as cellars, caves and mines. Bats hibernate between October and March. Hibernation is not a deep sleep, but rather a time which can last for weeks or even months during severe winters, when major physiological changes take place within the bat. The bats lower their normal body temperature, which is 37 degrees centigrade, to that of their surroundings, which is 8 degrees for the lesser horseshoe, but lower for some of the other species. This ability to drop their body temperature to save energy when insects are not available to eat is another major adaptation that enables bats to live in temperate countries like Ireland. In addition to lowering their body temperature, bats also lower their heart and respiration rates. In flight, a bat's heart beats at 800 beats per minute. In deep hibernation, this may be 18 to 80 beats per minute. The interval between two breaths in a hibernating bat can be up to 90 minutes, compared to 6 seconds when it is flying. By standing along these hedgerows and tracks leading from the house, we will hear their unmistakable call, which is a melodic warble and unlike anything produced by the Vesper bats. Horseshoe bats emit their echolocation call through the nose, using the structures on their face to direct the sound. This directionality helps the bats to find their insects and fly amongst the branches, but makes it hard for us to detect them using a bat detector, unless we are on their flight path. What frequency should we tune our detector so we can hear the warbling of the lesser horseshoe bat? So far, we have set our detector to 25 kHz for Leisler's bat and then 45 and 55 kHz for the pips. But now we need to go all the way up to 113 kHz to hear the lesser horseshoe, and although they produce short FM parts at the beginning and end of their call, the main part of the call is CF and 20 to 30 milliseconds long. There is a lot more we could say about the echolocation of horseshoe bats, but it involves discussing the harmonics of sound and Doppler shift, so I will stop talking now and we will wait and listen.
It's hard to believe that this sound we've just heard was produced by this little bat. To me, the sound of a lesser horseshoe bat in flight along a hedgerow is as haunting as that of the curlew. Unfortunately, the call of the lesser horseshoe bat could become as rare as that of the curlew because gaps have developed in its distribution and there is a lack of suitable habitat to ensure gene flow between the colonies in the 6 western counties. The main reasons for this are the loss of suitable roosts, removal of woodland and hedgerow for agricultural intensification and road development, and the increase in the amount of artificial light in the countryside. The most recent estimate for the number of lesser horseshoe bats along the west coast is just under 13,000 bats. We believe the best way to conserve the lesser horseshoe bat is to support farmers so that they can provide this species with roosts and new feeding habitats. We know that Limerick farmers are willing to do this because they helped us research this idea in 2017, and we are always seeking ways to finance such work. On one of the evenings we had the privilege to watch the lesser horseshoe bat emerge from the basement of the house, we were distracted by other bats flying about our heads, but they were not emitting warbling sounds. We quickly retuned our detectors to lower frequencies, and although we were within metres of the flying bats, we could hear only faint calls. Then the penny dropped. We were watching brown long-eared bats. Brown long-eared bats fly within or very close to vegetation in search of their food, so they produce quiet echolocation calls, because these don't have to travel too far in front of the bat. This means, though, that we need to be quite close to the bat to hear them, and often we can see them before we can hear anything on a detector. Let's make our way into the woodland, tune our detectors to 33 kHz, stay very still and quiet so that we can hear a brown long-eared bat hunting amongst the branches.
This bat's short, broad wings and rounded wingtips allow it to fly slowly, and because it also has a large tail membrane, it can hover in front of the branches and make tight turns. Our brief encounter with that brown long-eared bat shows us that it is always advisable to look as well as listen for bats, and listening is exactly what that long-eared bat was doing. It was using its wonderful long ears to pick up the rustling sounds of insects moving on leaves. This species emerges quite late, up to 40 minutes after sunset, because they need to wait until their insect prey has settled for the night on vegetation. But also, as a slow-flying species, they are at risk from predation by birds of prey. The final species we're going to encounter on this virtual bat walk is another late starter, beginning its hunt for insects up to 50 minutes after sunset. But first we need to leave the shelter of the woodland and walk back to the edge of the lake, because Although this species feeds in woodland, it puts on a wonderful flight display over water. We are now back at the lake, so tune your detectors to 40 kHz and direct them towards the water's edge, but also watch for movement over the surface of the lake.
We are now listening to Daubenton's bat, also known as the water bat. And if I were to shine a torch over the water for a few seconds, we would see a medium-sized bat flying just 25 centimetres above the surface of the lake, flying fast in a straight line and then making slow turns. There may also be occasional splashes, which is when the bat extends its large feet into the water to scoop up an insect. Its calls are short, so no tonal quality, hence we are hearing a series of ticks. What can we say about the rhythm of the calls? It seems at times to be quite regular, but then irregular. And this is because, as in all bats, the rhythm of the call is linked to both the speed and the way the bat is flying. Producing echolocation calls takes energy, and to produce this, bats generally produce the call on the upstroke of the wing beat. As the chest muscles tighten in on the upstroke, air is forced out of the lungs over the vocal cords, and this is what produces the call. When Daubenton's bat flies in a straight line, the calls will sound regular, but when it makes a deliberate turn, the repetition rate increases, then decreases, hence the irregular rhythm. What about the speed or repetition rate? Are the pulses coming fast or slow? The repetition rate for Daubenton's bat is 16 calls per second, so quite fast, certainly faster than the Leisler's calls we heard earlier.
Although we are tuned for Daubenton's bat, you may have heard a smacking sound, which was a pipistrelle cutting in. If you remember when we first encountered soprano pipistrelles feeding at dusk, we said their calls had an FM part, a tick, followed by a CF part, a smack. We now know that Daubenton's bat always sounds like a tick, but when both species are hunting at water like this, how can we tell them apart? The trick is to scan the frequencies quickly, starting at 70 kHz, down to 55, then 45, then 40 kHz, and even down to 35 kHz. If you continue to hear only ticks while you do this at a lake, then the bat is a Daubenton's bat. But as you pass through 55 or 45 kHz and the tick turns to a smack, you are listening to a pipistrelle bat, because at the lower frequencies you are hearing the CF tail. As we said at the outset of this walk, having a bat detector is just the start of a journey in learning how to distinguish the different species, but by constantly asking what the sound reminds you of. Is it a chop, a tick, a warble, or a smack? Is it fast or slow, loud or quiet, rhythmic or not? You will be able to eavesdrop on some of the most remarkable nocturnal mammals on the planet. Insect-eating bats consume millions of insects each summer, and so are important pest control agents, and they are the only animals on the wing from dawn to dusk, carrying out this essential service.
You may be wondering about the other two species we have in Ireland. These are called Natterer's bat and the whiskered bat. These two species are related to Daubenton's bat and are the hardest to separate from each other. We can really only be certain about Daubenton's bat when we see it in flight over water. All three species emit fast FM sounds without any tonal quality, and while there are ways to distinguish them, it involves a lot of practice and patience. We've come to the end of our virtual bat walk. Thank you for coming along with us, and we hope you will be able to do this outdoors with the Limerick Bat Group very soon. If you would like to find out more about bats, you can visit Vincent Wildlife Trust's website at vincentwildlife.ie, where there are free resources and information about Ireland's other mammals. Please also visit Bat Conservation Ireland website at batconservationireland.org for information on bat detectors and how you can participate in national surveys for bats. And of course, please go to the Facebook page of the Limerick Bat Group.